"You're not worth fighting for," my husband said like he was commenting on the weather. That was the cold start of my divorce. No warning, no build-up. Just a clean little sentence meant to flatten me in my own kitchen, the one I had scrubbed by hand when we couldn't afford help. He stood there relaxed, confident, already picturing his victory. House, cars, savings, even the dog. He said he didn't want our son, said it casually like he was declining dessert. I remember nodding slowly like I was agreeing with him. That nod fooled everyone. He told me he wanted a divorce because he needed peace. Funny word, peace, coming from a man who only felt calm when he was winning. He slid a printed list across the counter, neat bullet points already highlighted. I skimmed it once, then set it down carefully, the way you place something fragile even when it isn't. "You can have it all," I said. That was the moment he smiled. He smiled because he thought I was weak. Because people like him always confuse quiet with surrender. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wonder why I wasn't crying. He didn't notice my hands were steady. He just leaned back and let relief wash over his face like the universe had finally rewarded him for tolerating me. If you're watching this and thinking, why didn't she fight? Stay with me. You'll understand soon. And if stories about underestimated people turning the tables interest you, you might want to keep listening. My lawyer begged me to fight. She was good at her job. Sharp eyes, fast mouth. The kind of woman who'd built her career on never letting men like my husband get away with this kind of thing. She sat across from me in a small office that smelled like coffee and old paper, tapping her pen like she was keeping time with my pulse. "He's asking for everything," she said. "This isn't fair, we can win." I looked at the legal pads stacked on her desk, all those words meant to trap people in corners. I thought about how my husband had always loved corners, loved watching people realize there was nowhere left to stand. "Let him have it," I said. She stopped tapping. "You're making a mistake." I met her eyes. "No," I said softly, "I'm making a decision." Everyone thought I'd lost my mind, friends, family. Even strangers who heard the story through whispers and half-truths. They said things like, "She must be exhausted," or "She was always too emotional," or my favorite, "Some women just don't know their worth." I knew my worth. That's why I didn't argue. What no one understood was that I had spent years watching my husband closely, watching how he rushed when he thought he was winning, watching how careless he became when people stopped pushing back. He loved the finish line so much he never checked the ground beneath his feet. The court date came faster than I expected. Final hearing, one room, one judge, a few signatures that would decide who got what. My husband showed up in a tailored suit, shaking hands like he was closing a business deal. His lawyer wore the same expression, confident, bored, already done. I wore a plain dress. No jewelry, no makeup worth noticing. I looked exactly how they expected me to look. When it was time to sign, my lawyer leaned close and whispered one last time, "This is your chance." I picked up the pen. I signed everything over. The house, the cars, the accounts, every line. Clean, final. My husband smiled wider with every stroke of the pen. He didn't know the smile had a shelf life. Because while he was busy counting what he thought he'd won, he had no idea the game had already ended and not in his favor. He walked out of that courtroom thinking he owned my future, never realizing I'd already made sure he was standing on a trapdoor. People like my husband don't come from nowhere. They come from places like mine and spend their whole lives pretending they didn't. I grew up in a small town where everybody knew your last name before they knew your face. A place with one blinking traffic light, two churches, and a high school that doubled as a community center. My family lived on the edge of town, close enough to be counted, far enough to be forgotten. I was the quiet kid. Not the kind teachers worried about worse. The kind they overlooked. My older siblings were louder, sharper, easier to praise. One was the smart one, the other was the strong one. I was just there, helpful, reliable, invisible. At dinner, my father talked business with my brother. My mother worried about my sister's future. When I spoke, conversations kept going like my words were background noise. No cruelty, no drama. Just neglect wrapped in normalcy, which is harder to fight because no one believes it hurts. That's where I learned my first real skill, observation. I learned how to read rooms before I learned how to drive. I learned who mattered, who pretended to matter, and who made decisions when no one was watching. I learned that loud confidence often hides thin foundations, and quiet people tend to be underestimated because they don't advertise. I met my husband after I left town. He liked my background, said it made me grounded. What he meant was controllable. He shined in public, knew how to talk, knew how to charm. When people laughed at his jokes, he'd glance at me like I was part of the applause. Early on, I mistook that for partnership. I didn't see that he only valued me when I reflected him well. When we married, I supported his ambitions without question, helped with paperwork, helped with planning, helped smooth over mistakes he didn't even notice making. He'd say things like, "You're so good at details," then take credit for outcomes those details made possible. I didn't argue, I learned. While he climbed visibly, I built quietly. I took online courses at night after our son went to sleep. Finance, compliance, contract law, not enough to practice but enough to understand. Enough to know where people cut corners and how systems break when arrogance replaces caution. I handled our household finances because he didn't want the stress. I tracked accounts, payments, timelines. I noticed patterns, delays. Little inconsistencies that didn't matter until they did. He thought I was playing small. That's the thing about coming from nowhere. You learn early that survival doesn't look impressive. It looks patient. It looks boring. It looks like preparation disguised as obedience. When our marriage started cracking, I wasn't surprised. I'd felt the shift months before he said the word divorce. He'd started guarding his phone. Started coming home late with rehearsed explanations. Started treating me like a liability instead of a partner. Still, I stayed calm. Still, I watched. By the time he asked for everything, I already knew more about his world than he realized. Not secrets yet, not proof, just the outline of a structure built too fast on uneven ground. And I knew one more thing, something my small-town upbringing had burned into me early. People who underestimate you will hand you rope without checking what you plan to do with it. What he didn't know was that while he was busy rewriting our future, I was quietly learning exactly where his past didn't add up. Success didn't arrive for me with applause. It came in silence, in small locked rooms of focus no one bothered to knock on. After our son was born, my world shrank the way people expect it to. Playdates, school forms, grocery lists. Other parents assumed I'd stepped off the track for good. My husband encouraged that assumption. He liked telling people I was taking time to figure myself out as if I were a temporary project. I let him believe it. While he chased visibility, I chased structure. I took contract work online under a shortened version of my name, nothing flashy, just enough to build credibility without drawing attention. I helped small companies organize compliance records, clean up financial workflows, document processes they'd been winging for years. The kind of work no one brags about but everyone panics without. I learned where money leaks when people rush growth. I learned how fake numbers still pass initial inspections. I learned how easy it is for confident men to assume no one will ever look closely, especially not their own wives. Every night after our son fell asleep, I worked, not out of desperation, out of curiosity, out of discipline. I kept notes, timelines, screenshots. I wasn't hunting anything yet. I was training myself to see clearly. At home, I stayed unremarkable. I didn't challenge his stories. I didn't interrupt his victories. When he talked about deals, I listened like a fan, not a partner. That distance felt safer to him. He filled it with assumptions. People say marriages fail because of secrets. Ours failed because of blind spots. The more successful he became, the sloppier he got. He reused explanations, rounded numbers too cleanly, bragged about wins that didn't match cash flow. Nothing illegal on its own, just improbable, like a magician repeating the same trick too often. I filed it all away. When he finally asked for the divorce, I wasn't heartbroken. I was disappointed in how predictable it was. He thought leaving would simplify his life. He thought removing me would remove friction. What he didn't understand was that friction is what polishes stones. After he moved out, people expected me to unravel. Instead, I streamlined. I reduced expenses, reorganized routines, focused on our son with a steadiness that confused everyone. No rants, no revenge talk, just calm. That calm made my lawyer uneasy. "You're allowed to be angry," she said. "I am," I told her. Just not loud. She didn't know what to do with that. What I didn't tell her was that I had already taken steps. Legal ones, clean ones. I'd registered a consulting entity months earlier, quiet and compliant. I'd built professional relationships my husband had never met because he never asked who I talked to during the day. And somewhere between folding laundry and preparing school lunches, I realized something important. Power doesn't always look like control, sometimes it looks like leverage no one notices until it moves. I wasn't planning revenge yet, I was preparing clarity, because when the truth comes out, it doesn't need theatrics. It needs timing. I still hadn't touched his world, but I was closer than he ever imagined, and the cracks were starting to line up. After the separation, my husband started winning loudly. New car, new address. New friends who laughed a little too hard at his stories. He posted progress like proof that leaving me had unlocked his real life. People ate it up. They always do when confidence comes packaged with success. I watched quietly. Small-town instincts don't fade when you leave, they sharpen. I noticed the same vendors appearing in his stories, the same phrases repeated in interviews and casual conversations. I noticed how his timelines didn't align, how deals closed faster than due diligence ever should. Still, nothing that screamed scandal, just enough to whisper. Meanwhile, I focused on what I could control. I kept my income modest on paper, paid myself conservatively, reinvested quietly. My lawyer assumed I was scared to take up space. She didn't realize I was choosing where to stand. Family members pressured me. At least ask for the house. Think of your future. He's taking advantage of you. I nodded. I thanked them. I didn't explain, because explaining your strategy to people who don't see the whole board is just another way to lose. My son adjusted faster than anyone expected. Children understand stability better than adults. He noticed I wasn't tense. That mattered more than square footage. I built routines around him, steady mornings, predictable evenings. He slept better, so did I, and with that calm came clarity. One night, organizing old digital files, I noticed something I'd skipped over before, not because it was hidden, but because it didn't matter until then. A shared document folder, still syncing, still updating. He'd forgotten to disconnect access after moving out. I didn't open it right away. That's important, because restraint isn't about fear, it's about choosing the moment. Days later, curiosity nudged me, not desperation. Curiosity. Inside were drafts, projections, internal emails saved lazily instead of deleted, conversations that assumed no one else was looking. And suddenly, the pattern snapped into focus. Inflated valuations, misrepresented partnerships, funds moving sideways before being reported, not enough to crash immediately but enough to matter if light hit it at the wrong angle. I closed the folder, logged out, walked away. For weeks I didn't touch it again, because the worst thing you can do when you find the truth is rush. Truth needs framing, needs corroboration, needs patience. People think revenge is reactive. It's not, it's architectural. The divorce date approached. My husband called once, irritated I wasn't negotiating. "You sure you're okay with this?" he asked, like he was doing me a favor. "I'm sure," I said. He laughed. That laugh was loose now, careless. He thought the hard part was over. It was, just not for me. I finally understood what he'd built and exactly how fragile it was once someone bothered to look. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. I didn't go digging like a spy in a movie. I didn't hack anything. I didn't sneak around. I did something far more dangerous to someone like my husband. I followed the rules better than he did. I started by reconstructing timelines from public records, filings, announcements, press quotes he'd given without thinking twice. I compared them to internal drafts I'd seen once and memorized. Numbers that should have matched didn't. Dates overlapped where they shouldn't. Partnerships appeared in public before contracts existed privately. That's not ambition, that's misrepresentation. I reached out carefully to people in his orbit, not accusations. Just clarifying questions, the kind professionals ask every day. Can you confirm when this agreement was finalized? Who handled compliance on that expansion? Simple, neutral, boring. Boring is where people slip. The answers didn't line up, different versions from different mouths. Everyone assumed someone else had checked. Everyone trusted the confidence at the top. My husband's favorite shortcut had always been speed. He believed momentum could outrun scrutiny, and for a while it did. What raised the stakes wasn't just the money, it was the way risk had been shifted quietly onto people who trusted him, junior partners, contractors. Even a small nonprofit whose name he'd used to polish his image. They were listed where they shouldn't have been, exposed to liabilities they never agreed to carry, and suddenly this wasn't personal anymore. I documented everything the right way: dates, sources, public confirmations. I didn't jump to conclusions. I let facts stack until they leaned on each other. At the same time, I stayed invisible, no social posts. No courtroom theatrics. I let him enjoy the glow of his win. Let him move into the house he thought symbolized his freedom. The irony didn't escape me. At the final hearing, when I signed everything over, my lawyer looked like she was watching a slow-motion accident. She didn't know that by stepping away from assets, I'd stepped closer to the truth. Ownership creates noise, distance creates perspective. My husband walked out that day lighter, richer, louder. I walked out unburdened. What he didn't realize was that the documents he'd rushed, the corners he'd cut, the confidence he'd leaned on like a crutch, those things don't disappear just because a marriage ends. They wait, and I was done waiting. The evidence was solid now, but exposing it would require timing, allies, and one last move he'd never see coming. By the time I accepted what I was holding, I also understood what I wasn't. I wasn't a whistleblower chasing chaos. I wasn't a scorned ex trying to burn everything down. I was a witness with context, and that made all the difference. I consulted professionals, not dramatically, not emotionally, quiet meetings, hypotheticals. If someone noticed this pattern, how would it be handled? I never used his name. I didn't need to. The reactions told me enough. Raised eyebrows, long pauses, careful answers. This wasn't something that would vanish with a settlement check. What surprised me most wasn't his carelessness. It was his assumption that no one close to him would ever connect the dots. He'd built his life around visibility, assuming that the spotlight itself was protection. It isn't. The plan wasn't revenge yet, it was alignment. I made sure every piece I had could stand alone. Public record matched internal language. Independent confirmations echoed each other. No leaks, no hints. And then I waited. That waiting was the hardest part, not because I was afraid, but because I had to watch him thrive publicly while standing on ground I knew was hollow. He gave talks. He expanded. He smiled for cameras like a man who'd outrun consequences. People congratulated me on being so mature about the divorce. They said things like, "You took the high road." I thanked them, even though roads don't matter when you're building a bridge. Just before everything shifted, I did one small thing. I updated my consulting profile, nothing flashy, just enough to establish credibility in the exact areas his empire depended on: compliance, risk review, organizational transparency. That wasn't a coincidence. If you're listening to this and wondering why patience matters, this is why. Momentum amplifies exposure. The higher he climbed, the more visible the cracks became to people trained to look. And soon they did. The stage was set, the audience was gathering, and he still thought the story was about his victory. The exposure didn't start with a bang, it started with a question, a polite one. One that landed in his inbox from someone he couldn't ignore, a regulatory consultant invited in by a potential partner doing routine due diligence. That phrase alone can drain color from a confident man's face. Still, he wasn't worried. He never was at first. I know because he called me that night, not to accuse, not to ask for help, just to brag. "They're finally taking me seriously," he said, voice warm with pride. "Big opportunities. Bigger rooms?" I congratulated him. I meant it. Success doesn't vanish just because truth follows it. Then the questions multiplied, clarifications, requests for documentation. Follow-ups that referenced things he'd assumed no one remembered. He delegated, he delayed, he smoothed. The tricks that always worked before, this time they didn't, because the inquiry wasn't isolated, it aligned with others. Journalists asking about timelines, board members requesting independent verification, partners pausing instead of proceeding. Momentum slowed, and when momentum slows, gravity takes over. The first public sign was subtle, a postponed announcement, blamed on market conditions, then a canceled appearance, then a quiet resignation from a board he'd bragged about joining. People started whispering, not about me, about him. I stayed invisible, no comments, no satisfaction posts. I didn't need to say a word. Just before the climax, I'll say this: if stories about quiet intelligence and long games resonate with you, this is the moment to stay close. The real exposure came during a live industry forum he'd insisted on attending. He couldn't afford absence anymore. The consultant's findings had already circulated privately. All that was left was acknowledgement. A question was raised from the audience. Calm, precise, referencing publicly available discrepancies, his answer stumbled. Once, that's all it takes. The follow-up came from the moderator, then another attendee. Then the panel shifted from celebration to clarification in real time. Cameras captured every pause. By the time it ended, his authority had evaporated. He smiled less, spoke slower. The man who once rushed victory now couldn't outrun a sentence. And I watched from home, my son asleep in the next room, the TV volume low, knowing the hardest part was almost over. He thought the worst was done, but the reckoning was only halfway complete. After that forum, things unraveled fast but quietly. That's how reputations really collapse, not with sirens, with silence. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. Partners issued carefully worded statements about realigning priorities. The same people who once leaned toward him in rooms now leaned away, like proximity itself carried risk. He tried to regain control, issued clarifications, blamed misunderstandings, hired advisors who charged a lot and promised discretion, but discretion only works when there's still doubt, and by then, doubt was gone. What surprised him most was that no one rushed to defend him, because when trust breaks, people don't ask who caused it, they ask who ignored it. I stayed out of sight. No interviews, no quotes, no victory lap. That's the mistake people expect you to make. I let the process speak in its own language, reports, withdrawals, revisions. Then came the moment he finally reached out, not to threaten, not to boast, to ask. "What did you know?" he said. I paused before answering, not for drama, for accuracy. "Enough," I said. Silence stretched between us, the kind that tells you everything's already been decided. "You could have stopped this," he said finally. "I did," I replied. "I stopped it from being worse." He didn't understand that. He never would, because people who rush power don't recognize restraint as strength. The final confirmation came weeks later, a formal statement, neutral in tone, devastating in effect. His projects would be restructured, oversight installed, leadership roles reassigned, not prison, not spectacle, just removal, the thing he feared most, irrelevance, and I felt calm, not triumphant, not angry. Calm, like closing a door that had been drafty for years. What he lost publicly was only part of the story. The real ending happened where no cameras were watching. The day it finally ended, there was no announcement. No headline with my name in it, no dramatic confrontation where he apologized or admitted anything out loud. There was just a phone call from my lawyer. "It's done," she said. "Everything's settled. He won't be in a position to challenge anything again." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table, the smaller one, in the smaller place everyone had worried about me moving into, and listened to the hum of a normal afternoon. My son came home from school an hour later. He dropped his backpack, told me about a spelling test, asked what was for dinner. He didn't know about balance sheets or oversight committees or reputations collapsing under their own weight. He just knew he was safe. That was the real victory. People eventually figured it out, not the details but the shape of the truth. They noticed who was still standing, still steady, still building. They noticed who had gone quiet. A few reached out. "How did you know?" they asked. "Why didn't you fight harder in court?" I smiled when they said that. Fighting is loud, building is patient. Giving up the house freed me, letting go of the cars unburdened me. Signing those papers wasn't weakness, it was clarity. I chose stability over symbols. I chose timing over tantrums. And somewhere along the way, I realized something I wish I'd known earlier: power doesn't need witnesses to be real. My husband thought winning meant taking everything he could see. He never considered the value of what he couldn't measure: trust, credibility, patience, perspective. He left our marriage richer in assets and poorer in ground to stand on. I left lighter, clearer, in control. The world doesn't reward the loudest person in the room forever. Eventually, it favors the one who watched, learned, and moved when it mattered. So if you ever find yourself underestimated, rushed, or dismissed, remember this: staying low isn't losing, it's positioning, and the people who mistake your silence for weakness are usually the ones who hand you the ending. Never underestimate someone who stays quiet, works patiently, and understands the long game, because by the time you realize they've won, there's nothing left to take back.